Welcome to Week 6, Activity 4, Assessing the Classroom Environment. And today what we're going to do is go through some guided notes on specifically how to do this. You have a copy of the notes that you can fill out as we go along, and then this will help you to answer the reflection questions that you will submit for points. You do not need to submit this document. A little background information. I'm a requisite teacher that I worked with a number of years ago, and the principal is very concerned about her behavior management skills. Students were off task, often not engaged in the activities that were occurring in the classroom, but rather dealing with misbehavior, out of seat, talking, fighting, refusing to do work. So he had visited her classroom and met with her and shared that she needed to make some changes. She asked me for some assistance, and so what I did was the same thing that we do when we look at individual student behavior. I did an observation, collected some baseline data, and then used that to help me develop an intervention plan for her. So the first step that we looked at was actually doing a hypothesis, or coming up with a statement in terms of setting event, antecedent, problem, behavior, consequence, and the function of the behavior. Okay, so this works with teachers just the same as it does with students. Let's look and see what my hypothesis was. So I had interviewed Ima, and we really didn't come up with a setting event. I would say it probably was lack of preparation for different work that students were doing. Typically what would happen is she would give students an assigned task to do. They would be off task, talking, playing out of their seat, and Ima would yell and threaten students. And when I say yell, that's what I mean. She had a loud voice. You could hear her in my classroom next door through the walls. Okay, students would then quiet down and comply temporarily, okay, because she often did not acknowledge the fact that students were quiet. When students would quiet down temporarily, Ima escaped an aversive, which was the noise, the chaos in the classroom. So she was negatively reinforced. Okay. Students would then begin again in terms of this here cycle. They would become off task, talking, playing, out of seat. She would again yell and threaten. They would quiet down for a few seconds or minutes, and she'd escape that aversive. But because she didn't acknowledge the behavior or in some way reinforce it, then we started all over again. All right, this is what's called the criticism trap, and we'll talk a little bit more of this during our Big Blue Button session. Okay, so this was what we came up with, and I'm going to go back here for just a second, and let's see here. Okay, next page. Okay, we came up with a definition for on-task behavior. A student is judged to be on task if he or she is engaged independently in the following behaviors without a teacher-initiated prompt: eye contact, appropriate response, say touch, write, read, proper seated position. Okay, it's important that we have a definition of the behavior we want to collect data on. And this is what we wanted to look at. And if we look at the next page, down here, what we're going to do is we're going to do a 5-minute observation on different students every 5 seconds. We'll record a plot plus for on task, a check for off task, and when each student's been observed, we begin the progression again and continue until 5 minutes has lapsed. So if you look at this, this is broken down into 60 different cells, and each cell is representative of 5 seconds. We have 24 students in the classroom, so we're going to collect data on all 24 students. We look at one student, student 1 for 5 seconds, move to student 2, then student 3. If we look at the data here, student 1 and 2 were off task, student 3 was on task during that 5-second interval. Student 4 off, student 5 and 6, 7 on. And when we get down to number 24, then we start that all over again. So we go back to student 1, and under the cell for 25, we mark that, once again, that student is off task. So we progress for 5 minutes, 5-second intervals, and we collect data as to whether or not students are on task. If we look at this and the dimensions of behavior described in the definition, we're looking a lot at topography and locus. Okay, if we just look at on-task behavior, because we're talking about what it looks like and under what conditions that occurs. Okay, if we look at our tool on the next page, this is an interval recording. That's probably the most efficient way for us to collect behavior. Okay, and if we were to come up with a rationale, this is the one that I would choose. This provides an overall sampling of all students' on-task behavior in an efficient way. Behaviors do not have a clear beginning or end and would take far too long to sample all students using a different recording system. Remember, this is a sampling of student behavior. So it's looking at a specific time and looking across all of the different students. So let's look and see what our data told us. Okay, so if we look here, this is the data we collected. We had 24 students, and if we count up pluses and checks, okay, then we can calculate a percent of intervals that students were on task. Now this is a percent of intervals, of 5-second intervals. And then we can use that information to help to drive whatever our intervention is going to be. If we look at the research tells us that students' on-task behavior should exceed 90%. Go ahead and figure out what you see as the percent of on-task behavior, and then we'll write a summary of statements. So stop the video, calculate it, and then we'll come back and do that. Oops. Alright, here's what I came up with. 27 cells had pluses. So if I divide 27 by 60, I get 45% on task behavior. Here's the summary statement that I wrote as a result of the data that I found. Okay, remember that in your summary statement, it shares a descriptive definition and information about the behavior. So 5 minute, 5-second whole interval time sampling of student on task behavior during large instruction. So the type of sampling and the conditions under which that sampling occurred. Students were actively engaged 45% of the time. The results of this observation are significantly below the recommended on-task behavior of 90% or better. This is an area that Ms. Reck may want to consider identifying strategies to increase the on-task behavior. Alright, after we did that, we then wanted to spend a little bit more time looking at several other areas that impact classroom management. So if we look at this page, what we're seeing here is a tool to look at opportunities to respond and teacher feedback. In the next chapter in your book, it'll talk about opportunities to respond. Specifically, what that is teacher asks students to respond, and then we're able to get some information from that. The more teachers engage students in responses, the more likely we are to have good academic engagement and student learning occurring. So if we look at this data here, and this is purely frequency data, that's all. Okay, so we looked at second grade reading instruction. We took a 10-minute sampling of our data. During that time, what we saw was that positive interactions or contact, so that's a smile, a nod, good job, a point, occurred 6 times in that 10 minutes, and it occurred, negative contact occurred 11 times. Okay, so here then what we can do is we can get a ratio of teacher feedback during instruction. And here we have a ratio of 0.54 to 1 of positive to negative. The ideal is 4 to 1. So there are 4 positive contacts or interactions with students for every 1 negative student contact. Some of the literature will go up even to 6 to 1. But I think if we look at 4 to 1, 3 to 1, that's a good place to begin. All right. So if we look at the data on I'm a Rec, and here we're just looking at teacher feedback. We're not looking at opportunities to respond. We'll do that later. We can see that they're substantially low. Students get at a rate of, for every 2 negative, 1 positive. Alright, so let's look at the summary statement that we wrote. Go ahead and try writing one for yourself, and then I'll show you the one that I wrote. So take a moment, stop the video, and then we'll compare. Here's the summary statement that I wrote. During a 10-minute observation of a large group reading lesson, I'm a Rec's ratio of positive student contact to negative student contact was 0.54 to 1 or 6 to 11. The ideal ratio for positive to negative is 5 positive for every 1 negative. Okay, so this statement just gives us the data and what the expected criteria might be. Okay. So we can see again, not only is I'm having difficulty with on-task behavior of students, the amount of positive feedback to negative is substantially low in the classroom as well. Okay, the next thing that we wanted to do for these initial observations and baseline data for looking at IMA's classroom was to conduct a brief classroom walkthrough. Okay, classroom walkthrough is an observation tool that provides a quick glimpse at different items that are occurring in the classroom or behaviors that we're looking for and that we know from the research are important to behavior management, effective behavior management. So this is one that I did, and I can see I got a misspelled word, so I'm going to fix it. And so we had 24 students, we had 1 additional support staff in the classroom, and this was happening during reading instruction. So what we did was during this 10 minutes, we were looking for these specific behaviors: rules posted, behavioral expectations introduced at the onset of a lesson, materials organized, monitoring students' behavior as related to interaction with others, feedback, specific corrective prompts to students for mild inappropriate behavior, then specific consequence for moderate to severe behavior, treat students with respect, and then students experience the 5 positive interactions from teacher for each negative. And all we're doing here is just identifying yes or no. Okay, these are all behaviors that we know lend to effective, efficient behavior management. And so during that 10 minutes, we indicated either by yes, we observed it, or no, we did not. And then we're able to come up with a summary statement specific to that. Okay, so take a moment, write down what you think is a good summary statement, and then we'll compare notes. Okay, so here's what I have. During the 30-minute observation of a class-wide teacher-led reading lesson, she consistently performed 7 of the 10 management strategies. It's recommended that Ms. Rex state and consistently provide feedback on behavioral expectations at the onset and throughout the lesson, and that focusing on these strategies will increase student engagement and the quality of interaction between teacher and student. So here we summarize the data and then provided a recommendation. So as I'm doing this, part of what my goal was to build a case for what was occurring so that I had some objective data and information that IMA could review and then would help us to come up with a plan for her. So then our next step was to really use this data. So what did we learn from conducting the observation? Okay, it allowed us to look at behavior in a number of areas and then provide her with some data. So the classroom walkthrough substantiated the data we collected on positive and negative interaction, as well as student on-task behavior. So this was more of an informal way of looking at the behaviors that were occurring, whereas the other two were more quantitative data management observation tools. And so this helps us to substantiate the fact that increasing student engagement and the quality of teacher interaction will substantially reduce the problem behaviors currently occurring. So we can see from the data that we collected that there are a couple of areas of weakness, and use that to help IMA develop a plan. And I don't have, okay, here we go. I need to go down on the page, sorry about that. The other thing we always want to do is we want to talk about what the teacher did well. So after I summarize the data, I want to state, here's what I think you did well, Ima. Okay, her classroom is clean and neat and it's well organized. Okay, and her students and Ms. Reck make an effort to be respectful of her students and their peers. So there is some respect occurring within that classroom, and I think this is an important thing to acknowledge. We can build on the fact that students treat each other with respect, and we can then relate that to teaching the students to also do this in regards to Ms. Reck. Okay, if we look at the data we've collected and some recommendations, then here's what we come up with. One is to increase opportunities for students to respond during group instruction using a variety of modes of expression that engage all students. Okay. When we look at the lessons that IMA's teaching, what we see is a lot of off-task behavior. Now, if all the students are responding at the same time, that's going to increase on-task behavior. So coming up with some strategies such as using response cards, choral responses, having activities where students touch, write, say all at the same time is going to increase that engagement and will consequently result in less problem behavior and better quality of learning. So instead of one student responding, all 24 are, which means they're practicing and they're learning the responses that are required. The other thing that we could talk with IMA about is teaching the expectations for the different routines used in the classroom. She needs to specifically state what her expectations are at the onset of all tasks and activities that the students are requested to complete. She'll tell students to go to work, and then when the noise begins to erupt, then she scolds them and they will temporarily quiet down, and then we start the cycle over. What she needs to do is specifically state behavioral expectations for that particular task. I need all students to stay in their seats, work quietly, and complete their work. If you have a question, raise your hand. I will acknowledge it, and I will be there as soon as I can. And then she needs to consistently and contingently reinforce that behavior. And we'll talk about that in our next Big Blue Button presentation. So these simple things will make a difference, and she will begin to see some changes. So now what I'd like to have you do is to review. You may want to go back and review this video one last time, and then respond to the questions for activity 4 that's been provided for you, and then submit that for your points. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see you in our next session.